Frederick Rhodes had stolen everything he ever owned, and the day he rode into Caldwell, Kansas, he fully intended to steal something again. The summer of 1878 sat heavy and dry across the Kansas plains, the kind of heat that cracked the earth open like old leather and made men mean before noon. Caldwell was a cattle town, newly incorporated and struggling to hold itself together with ordinances nobody followed, and a sheriff who spent more time mediating saloon disputes than solving crimes. It was the kind of town Frederick had passed through a dozen times, a cluster of buildings pressed against the horizon like an afterthought, wooden storefronts bleached pale by the sun, a water trough that smelled of iron and horse, and somewhere behind all of it, the low constant moan of the wind coming down off the open range. He was 26 years old and looked older by 10 years. His face carried the particular weathering of a man who had spent his entire life outdoors whether he wanted to or not. There was a scar along his jaw from a knife fight in Abilene when he was 19, a burn mark on his left forearm from a branding iron accident that had not been an accident, and eyes so dark and steady that most men looked away from them rather than hold them for too long. He rode a gray roan named Cutter, a horse he had won at cards in Dodge City, and one of the few things in his life that had come to him through any kind of luck rather than pure necessity. He had been raised in the camps that followed the cattle drives. His mother had cooked for drovers since before Frederick could remember clearly, washing pots in river water and stretching flour and salt pork into meals that somehow kept 20 men upright. His father had driven cattle, had drunk heavily between drives, and had taught Frederick two lessons with absolute consistency: that the world did not owe any man anything, and that a man who hesitated lost. Frederick had watched his father take what he wanted from bunkhouses and supply wagons, and occasionally from other men's pockets, and he had absorbed this lesson the way children absorb everything their fathers do, not through admiration, but through simple proximity, the way water takes on the color of whatever it sits beside long enough. By 15, he was running errands for a man named Harker who moved horses across county lines without caring much about whose horses they had been before. By 18, he had graduated to more deliberate work, not exactly outlawing, not exactly honest labor, but something in between that kept him fed and occasionally well-rested, and never, ever settled. He had not spent more than 6 consecutive weeks in any single place since he was a boy. And yet here he was riding into Caldwell with something other than his usual calculation sitting in his chest, something he could not name precisely, but that felt uncomfortably like restlessness of a different kind. He had spent the last 2 weeks on the open plain after a deal gone bad in Wichita, a livestock arrangement that had unraveled when one of his partners decided to negotiate separately with the buyer, and he had been riding and sleeping rough and thinking more than he liked. Thinking had never served Frederick Rhodes particularly well. Action served him. Movement served him. The moment he stopped moving, the life he was living had a way of becoming visible to him in its full dimensions, and he did not enjoy what he saw. He needed work. Honest work, for once, or near enough to it that he could look at himself in the glass above a barbershop sink without the particular flat expression he had grown accustomed to wearing. He tied Cutter to the rail outside the Caldwell General Store and went inside to get his bearings and buy tobacco, which he had been out of for 3 days and felt the lack of keenly. The store smelled of sawdust and dried herbs and leather goods, that particular layered smell of commerce that Frederick associated with towns that had not yet given up on themselves. There were shelves of dry goods along both walls, a glass case at the back displaying ammunition and a few modest pieces of jewelry, and a counter behind which a heavy-set man with pale whiskers was measuring out flour into brown paper sacks. Frederick moved along the shelves, picking up the tobacco, and then stopped. There was a woman at the back counter and she was arguing. She was not arguing loudly. That was the first thing Frederick noticed. She kept her voice at a controlled and even pitch, the kind of voice that had been trained not to rise even when it wanted to. She wore a plain calico dress the color of summer prairie grass, faded somewhat at the cuffs, and her dark hair was pinned up in a way that suggested it had been done carefully that morning, and had since been partially undone by whatever the day had brought her. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with a face that was not classically pretty in the way of portraits, but was arresting in a more fundamental way, strong-jawed, clear-eyed, with a kind of determined expression that made Frederick think of a person who has made peace with a hard road and intends to walk it anyway. "The contract says 30 days credit," she was saying to the man behind the counter. "I have the paper right here, Mr. Gibbs, signed by you in March." The man called Gibbs had the expression of someone who has been caught at something small and is trying to make it seem like a matter of principle. "Miss Aldridge, circumstances have changed since March." "I can't keep extending. The circumstances of the contract have not changed," she said. "I am asking for what the paper says I am owed." Frederick should have taken his tobacco and left. He was not a man who involved himself in other people's negotiations. It was one of his longest-standing habits, right alongside not asking questions that did not concern him and not giving his real name to anyone he had just met. Instead, he walked to the counter and set his tobacco down and waited with what he hoped was a patient expression, while the argument continued. Gibbs finally agreed to honor 2 more weeks of credit on supplies, clearly deciding that the woman called Miss Aldridge was not going to relent, and she thanked him in a tone that was polite and entirely unapologetic and gathered her parcel and turned to go. She nearly walked directly into Frederick's chest, stepped back and looked at him with large gray eyes that held, he noticed, not a trace of the flustered embarrassment most people would have shown. "Pardon me," she said. "No harm," he said. She looked at him for one level moment, the way a person looks at a door before deciding whether to open it, and then she walked past him and out of the store. Frederick paid for his tobacco and stood there for an extra moment in which he became aware that something had shifted, slightly and without his permission, in the interior of his chest. He asked Gibbs who she was. "Lenora Aldridge," Gibbs said, rolling the name out with a kind of weighted familiarity. "Her father passed this spring. Ran the Aldridge quarter horse outfit about 8 miles east of town. She's been trying to keep it running herself since then. Foolish, if you ask me." He did not look like a man who believed his opinion would be questioned. Frederick did not offer one. He pocketed his tobacco and went outside. He sat on the boardwalk for a while smoking and watching the street, which was the habit of a man accustomed to sizing up situations before committing to them. Caldwell had 3 saloons that he could count: a livery stable, a modest hotel, a land office, a barber shop, and what appeared to be a church that was still under construction based on the unfinished steeple listing slightly to the left. The cattle trade moved through here. He could see the pens at the south end of town, and where cattle moved, there was work for men who knew horses and were willing to be up before the sun. He could stay a while. That was the thought that surprised him most when he examined it. He had not planned to stay anywhere, and here he was entertaining the notion of putting down at least a temporary root in a town he had been in for under an hour. He told himself it was practical. Cutter needed proper rest and decent feed, and Frederick himself was tired in a way that went past his muscles. He got a room at the hotel and slept better than he had in 2 weeks. In the morning he went to the livery stable and asked about work. The owner, a man named Jerwood with a magnificent graying beard and strong opinions about horseshoes, hired Frederick on a trial basis to help manage the overflow of horses coming in with the summer drives. The work was physical and demanded nothing Frederick did not already know. He spent the first 3 days building a quiet reputation as someone who was good with horses and did not cause problems, which was the most anyone expected of a stranger. On the 4th day, he rode out east along the main road with no particular stated purpose and happened to pass the turnoff that led to the Aldridge property. He knew it was the Aldridge property because there was a painted wooden sign at the gate, weathered but intact, reading ALDRIDGE quarter HORSCS EST, 1863. The gate itself was in need of repair. One of the posts had heeled over and the latch would not have kept a determined dog inside, let alone a horse. Down the lane he could see the main house, modest, two-story, built of the same pale timber that everything in Kansas seemed to be built of, and beyond it a stable and a small corral containing what appeared to be 4 horses and one very determined woman trying to load a 5th one into a trailer hitched behind a mule. The horse was not cooperating. Frederick sat on Cutter at the gate for a moment, watching. Lenora Aldridge, and he knew it was her. There was no mistaking that posture. That exact brand of controlled determination was talking steadily to the horse, a bay mare that was stamping and tossing her head and refusing absolutely to step up the ramp. Every time the woman got the mare's front feet close to the ramp, the animal would shy sideways and pull back, and the whole sequence would begin again. He could ride on. He should ride on. He opened the gate. The latch really was useless. It swung open with one finger, rode down the lane, dismounted at the corral fence, tied Cutter to the post, and went in through the gate without asking. "You are approaching from the wrong side," he said, not loudly because he did not want to startle the mare. Lenora Aldridge turned and looked at him. To her credit, she did not appear startled herself. She appeared, if anything, cautiously thoughtful, the way someone appears when they are deciding whether to be annoyed or interested. "I know how to load a horse," she said. "Yes, ma'am. You are loading her into the wind, though. She does not like what she is smelling. If you turn the trailer around, she will step right up." A pause. The mare stamped. Lenora Aldridge looked at him and then looked at the trailer and then looked at the direction of the wind, and he watched the calculation move through her eyes. "That would require unhitching the mule," she said. "It would, but it would be faster than what you are doing now." Another pause. "Who are you?" "Frederick Rhodes. I am working at the Jerwood livery. I was riding past. You came down my lane." "The gate was open," he said, which was technically true, and they both knew it was not the whole truth. She looked at him for a long, measured moment. Then she said, "The mule's name is Abraham. He does not like being rushed." "I will be gentle with him," Frederick said. They unhitched Abraham, who bore the indignity with great patience, and turned the trailer around so that its opening faced into the wind rather than against it. When Lenora led the bay mare back to the ramp, the animal sniffed twice, considered the situation with the profound deliberation of horses, and walked calmly up and into the trailer. Frederick stood back and watched. He was aware of being watched in return. "Thank you," Lenora said. She was wiping her hands on a cloth she had pulled from her apron pocket, and her tone was genuine rather than perfunctory. "I have been at that for 40 minutes. The wind shifts mid-morning out here, catches people off guard." "I should have known it," she said, with a directness that suggested she held herself to high standards and did not much enjoy falling short of them. "I grew up here. I know this wind." "A person can know something and still be too tired to think of it," Frederick said. She looked at him again, and this time the look was different, slightly surprised, slightly more open. He had the feeling he had said something she had not expected from a stranger who had walked in through her gate. "I suppose that is true," she said. He did not stay long that day. He helped her rehitch Abraham and did not ask where she was taking the mare, because it was not his business. He tipped his hat at the lane and rode back toward town, and he thought about the way she talked, careful and direct, and with no performance in it, for the entire 8 miles back. He came back 2 days later. He told himself he had a practical reason. He had noticed the broken gate post on his way out and had been thinking about it. And since he had some hours free in the afternoon and the wood and tools were available at the livery, it seemed wasteful not to. She was in the stable when he arrived, cleaning hooves on a young gelding, and she looked up when he came in and said, "You are back." "Your gate post is heeled over," he said. "I brought what is needed to fix it." She straightened up and studied him. "Mr. Rhodes, do you have a habit of repairing things on other people's property without being asked?" "Only when the things in question need repairing," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I cannot pay you. I know it. I did not come for pay." "Then why did you come?" He thought about that honestly for a second, which was long enough. "I am not entirely sure," he said, "but the gate post is still heeled over." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the predecessor to one. "The tools are in the shed at the back," she said. "I will bring you water when you need it." He spent 2 hours on the gate post, working in the afternoon heat that pressed down on the Kansas plains like a hand on a man's shoulders. She brought him water twice, and the second time she sat down on the fence rail and watched him work, and they talked, not about anything particular, not at first. He asked about the quarter horses, and she told him the history of the operation, how her father had started it with 6 mares brought up from Texas, how they had built the breeding program over 15 years, how they now supplied horses to ranchers across 3 counties. She spoke about the horses with an authority and a quiet pride that Frederick found he liked to listen to. "It must be a great deal to manage alone," he said. "It is," she said without any self-pity. "My father had 2 hired hands, both left after he died. There is not enough in the account to hire them back until I sell this season's stock, and I cannot properly show the stock without—" She stopped, apparently rearranging what she was going to say. "It is a temporary difficulty." Frederick drove the last nail into the repaired post and tested it with both hands. Solid. "I have some free time in the mornings," he said, "before the livery opens, if you need help with the horses." She looked at him very carefully. "Why?" "Because I am good with horses and you need the help." "That is a practical answer," she said. "It is not a complete one." He looked at her. She looked back without flinching, without any coyness, just waiting. He had never met a person who waited quite like that, with such patient, clear-eyed expectation. "No," he admitted, "it is not a complete one." She thought about it for a long moment, turning her cloth over in her hands. "Tomorrow morning," she said, 6 o'clock, I start with feeding." "I will be here," he said. He was. And then he was there again the morning after that, and the morning after that. The arrangement became its own kind of structure before either of them formally acknowledged it. In the mornings, Frederick would ride out from town in the first gray light, when the air still held the previous night's coolness, and the sky over the flat Kansas horizon was beginning to sort itself out from black into something softer. He would arrive at the Aldridge farm as Lenora was carrying the first buckets of feed from the barn, and he would take the buckets without ceremony, and they would move through the morning chores with the quiet efficiency of people who work well together, which they did, almost from the first, in the way that some people simply fit in the same rhythm without having to negotiate it. He learned the horses. There was the bay mare, whose name was Rosalie, who had a sensitivity to wind. There were 3 young geldings being trained for ranch work, steady, reliable animals with the compact muscled bodies that quarter horses were known for. There was an older stallion named Porter, who was the foundation of the breeding program, and who regarded Frederick with deep suspicion for the first week before allowing him to approach without laying his ears back. There were 2 mares in foal, and a third that had produced a filly in early May, who was now long-legged and curious, and getting into everything she could reach. Frederick named the filly Trouble, which was not an official name since it was Lenora's horse and Lenora's choice, but the name stuck between them and eventually just became what they called her. He learned Lenora in the same way gradually, through observation and proximity, and the particular intimacy of shared work. She was stubborn with a principled quality to it, not stubbornness for its own sake, but because she had worked out what she believed and did not abandon it easily. She was efficient and pragmatic, and she did not waste words, which Frederick, who had spent his life around men who used many words to say very little, appreciated deeply. She was also, when she relaxed enough to allow it, quietly funny, a dry, sideways humor that she delivered with a straight face, and that caught him off guard every time, which she seemed to know and possibly take some pleasure in. He did not tell her much about himself, not at first. She did not ask directly, which he thought was either good manners or good judgment, and he suspected it was both. But pieces came out, the way pieces do when 2 people spend enough hours together working and talking in the off moments between work. "Where are you from originally?" she asked one morning about 3 weeks in as they were walking the fence line on the east boundary of the property checking for gaps. "Everywhere and nowhere particular," he said. "I grew up on the drives. My mother cooked for drovers. That is a hard life for a woman." "She was a hard woman," he said. "In the good sense of it, I think. She managed." "And your father," a beat. "He drove cattle," he said. "He died when I was 16, fever up in Colorado." She nodded, letting it settle. "I lost my mother when I was 12, she said. "My father raised me from there. He was not what most people would call warm, but he was fair, and he taught me everything about horses and land, and I think that is its own kind of love." Frederick looked at the fence post he was testing, which was solid. "I think it is," he said. "What about you?" she said. "When you were young, was your father—" "He taught me what he knew," Frederick said, "which was mostly how to get by." She accepted this. She was good at accepting partial answers without making a person feel like they owed her the rest, which made it easier, eventually, to offer the rest voluntarily. That moment came on an evening in mid-July, about 6 weeks after he had first ridden down her lane. He had stayed past his usual morning hours because one of the mares in foal had shown signs of distress, and they had both been monitoring her. The foal did not come that day. It would come 3 days later, healthy and loudly indignant, a red roan colt that Lenora would name Jasper. But by the time they were satisfied the mare was stable for the night, the sun was going down, and Lenora had offered him supper and he had accepted. They ate at the kitchen table, which was plain pine worn smooth with years of use, with a coal oil lamp between them throwing soft light. She had made salt pork and beans and cornbread, simple food cooked well, and there was something about sitting across a table from her in lamplight that stripped away whatever exterior Frederick habitually maintained and left him somewhat more exposed than he was comfortable with. "You can ask," he said, when they had been eating in quiet for a while. She looked up. "Ask what?" "Whatever it is you have been thinking for the last month," he said. "About where I came from and what I have been doing." She considered him. "All right," she said. "What have you been doing, Frederick?" It was the first time she had used his given name without the Mr. in front of it, and the effect of it was small and entirely disproportionate. He told her. Not all of it, not the specifics of everything, not the names or places that would have told a lawman something useful, but the shape of it. The drifting. The jobs that existed in the gray country between legal and otherwise. The horse-moving work with Harker. The years of scraping and taking and surviving, without much thought beyond the next day or the next dollar. He told it plainly, without excusing it, the way he had learned to tell things that were true, because glamorizing them would have been a lie and minimizing them would have been a different kind of lie. When he finished, the lamp burned between them, and outside the coyotes were starting up their nighttime conversation with the dark. Lenora had listened to all of it without any particular visible reaction. Now she said, "And what are you doing now?" "Working at Durwood's," he said. "And coming here mornings." "Yes," she said, "but what are you doing? What is the intention in it?" He looked at her across the lamp. She looked back, with those gray eyes that he had decided, over the course of 6 weeks, were the steadiest and most honest eyes he had ever looked into. "Trying to be the kind of man who deserves to be around people like you," he said. He had not planned to say it. It came out with a directness that surprised him almost as much as it appeared to surprise her. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when something true has been said, and both people are giving it the respect of not rushing to fill the space around it. "That is a better answer than the practical one," she said finally, very quietly. "I have more of them if I think about it long enough," he said. Something happened in her expression then, a softening, slight but real, like the earliest change in the light before sunrise when the darkness is still there, but you begin to understand that it is not going to last. "I think maybe you should think about it more then," she said. That was how it began to become what it was becoming. He had never courted anyone. That was the plain truth of it. He had known women in the way of a young man who moves from town to town, and does not stay anywhere brief and uncomplicated, without tenderness on either side, without the expectation of it. He had never pursued a woman with the intention of being known by her, of allowing himself to be seen fully. He had not believed he had anything worth seeing. With Lenora, it was different, and the difference was disorienting in the same way that a man is disoriented when he has been in the dark a long time and steps into light, not immediately comfortable, but not something he wants to step away from either. He brought her a book he found at the dry goods store, a collected volume of natural history with illustrations, because she had mentioned once in passing that her father's library had been auctioned with the other contents of the parlor when she needed to raise quick money the spring after his death, and she missed having something to read in the evenings. He left it on the fence post by the gate one morning before she came out, and did not mention it until she brought it up herself 3 days later. "Did you leave a book on my fence post?" she asked midway through the morning chores. "The post needed something on it," he said. "It looked bare." "That is the most elaborate excuse I have ever heard for giving someone a gift," she said, and the way she said it made something in his chest do the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency in her presence. "Did you like it?" he asked. "I have read it twice already," she said, and went back to what she was doing, and he watched her from the corner of his eye and thought that he was in serious trouble of the best possible kind. The summer deepened. The heat was immense and constant, a flat white pressure that turned the plains to something like a painting, bleached and still and enormous. Frederick learned the rhythms of the Aldridge operation, and they became natural to him in a way that no work had been before, because they were connected to something beyond mere survival. He began making small improvements: a repaired water trough, a rehung barn door that had been catching on its frame, a replacement section of fence along the south boundary, where 3 posts had been lost to the spring flooding of the small creek that ran below the property. He did these things as they presented themselves, and he did them well, because doing a thing well when you could had not always been a value he had held but was becoming one. There was a man in town named Calvin Prout who complicated things. Prout was a land agent, or called himself one, though the full extent of his operations was somewhat ambiguous, who had arrived in Caldwell in the spring, and had been making inquiries about properties in the surrounding area. He was the kind of man who wore a town coat and a polished watch chain, and used formal language to create an impression of legitimacy that Frederick's instincts recognized as performance rather than substance. He had made an offer on the Aldridge property in April, which Lenora had declined. He had made another in June, which she had also declined. And in the last week of July, just as the summer was reaching its most merciless pitch, he drove out to the farm in his rented buggy and arrived while Frederick was there. Frederick was mending a section of paddock fence when Prout drove up. He watched the man get down from the buggy and smooth his coat, and approach the house with the practiced assurance of someone who is not accustomed to being told no in a way that he takes seriously. Lenora came to the door and they spoke on the porch. Frederick went on working. He could hear the conversation well enough. The still Kansas air carried sound across flat ground as efficiently as a telegraph wire. Prout's offer had improved considerably from June. He was now offering a sum for the property that Frederick recognized was reasonably fair market value for the land, if somewhat below what the horses and the operation itself were worth. He presented it smoothly, with the particular language of reasonable men making reasonable proposals, and Frederick watched Lenora's face from a distance and saw the exact expression she made when she was managing something that required managing. "I am not interested in selling, Mr. Prout," she said, in the same even controlled voice she used for everything that required control. "Miss Aldridge, with respect, the situation of a woman managing a livestock operation of this scale the situation of a woman managing a livestock operation of this scale," she said, "is exactly that. Mine to manage." Prout glanced over and saw Frederick watching. Something moved in his expression, a slight recalibration, like a man adjusting his position when he realizes the ground is different than he thought. "I will leave the offer open," Prout said pleasantly, and got back in his buggy and drove away. Frederick walked over when the buggy was down the lane and gone. Lenora was still standing on the porch with her arms folded, watching the dust. "He is going to come back," Frederick said. "I know it," she said. "What does he want with the property, do you think, beyond the obvious?" "There are rumors that the railroad is surveying a new spur line through this part of the county," she said. "If they come through east of town, this land is in a very useful position." She looked at him directly. "I am not unaware of the situation, Frederick. I simply do not intend to sell." "I know it," he said, using her own phrase back to her, which he had begun to do without thinking about it and which she noticed, he thought, without saying anything about it. "Could you stay an extra hour this afternoon?" she said. "I want to move Porter and the mares to the north pasture before it rains." She glanced at the sky, which had been building clouds since noon. "I will stay as long as you need," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then she said, "Come inside and eat something first. You have been working since 6. He followed her into the kitchen, which smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and the bread she had baked that morning, and he sat at the plain pine table in the daylight this time, and she put food in front of him and sat down across from him with her own, and it occurred to Frederick Rhodes, who had been raised in camps and bunkhouses and the open air, who had never sat across a table from a woman as though it were a matter of course and belonging, that this was perhaps the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him, dangerous because he wanted it. Not in the way he had wanted things before, with the quick practical hunger of a man taking what was in reach, but with a patience and a depth he did not quite have words for. He wanted to be here tomorrow morning and the morning after, carrying feed buckets and fixing fence posts and sitting across this table in the daylight and in the lamplight. He wanted to be the kind of man who got to want that. And he was not sure he knew how to be, and the gap between where he was and where that life required him to be felt in that moment enormously wide. She was watching him. She had the quality of a person who sees things. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Whether I am good enough at this," he said. "At what? The fence work is fine." "Not the fence work," he said. A pause. She set down her fork. "Frederick, I know what I have been," he said. "I know the distance between that and this." "Do you think I do not know what you have been?" she said. "You told me yourself. I am not a person who makes decisions without information." "No," he said, "you are not." "Then you should know," she said, "that I consider a man more by what he is trying to become than by what he has come from." She said it matter-of-factly, as if it were simply an accurate description of her methodology rather than something that would land in the chest of the right person with the weight of a revelation. "My father came to Kansas with nothing, less than nothing. He owed money in Missouri and had bad history in 2 states. He built something here. He was not a different man for his past. He was the same man, changed." Frederick looked at her across the table. "And you believe that is possible," he said, "not as a theory. You actually believe it." "I believe it in your case specifically," she said, "or I would not have let you come back after the first morning." He had spent 26 years learning not to be moved by things, because moving was danger and staying hard was survival. He had been quite good at it. He was sitting in Lenora Aldridge's kitchen in the late July heat with rain building in the west, and he was being moved, and he did not try to stop it. "Lenora," he said. "Yes," she said, in a way that was both answer and acknowledgement. "I am going to stop working for Durwood at the end of the month," he said. "There is a possibility of a different position. One of the ranchers south of town, a man named Elias Coffey, he is looking for someone to manage his remuda for the fall drives. It is proper work, good pay, a bunkhouse berth." She was quiet for a moment and he could not read her expression precisely. "That would take you away from town," she said. "Not permanently," he said. "The drives run to late October. After that," he stopped. He had never said after that in relation to a place before. "After that, if I had reason to come back here, I would." The rain came in that afternoon with thunder and the smell of ozone off the plains, and they moved Porter and the mares to the north pasture ahead of it, and shut the barn against the wind, and stood together in the doorway of the stable watching. The sky come down to meet the earth with a kind of dramatic prairie intimacy that flattened everything and made the world feel simultaneously enormous and very small. The horses moved and settled behind them. The rain hit the roof in a continuous solid sheet. Frederick stood beside Lenora Aldridge in the doorway of her stable, and they were close enough that he could have put his hand in hers without moving more than an inch, and he was very aware of that inch. "You said if you had reason to come back," she said, above the rain. "Yes," he said. "I am giving you reason," she said. He turned to look at her. She was watching the rain, her face in profile, and there was color in her cheeks that might have been the humidity and might have been something else. "Lenora," he said. She turned and looked at him, and he put his hand alongside her jaw very carefully, the way you handle something you are terrified of breaking, and she did not pull away, and he kissed her once slowly in the doorway of her stable with the Kansas rain coming down in sheets around them, and when he pulled back she had her eyes closed for a moment, and then she opened them and looked at him and said nothing, and he said nothing, and the rain kept coming. He took the job with Elia's coffee. August was a hard-working month. The coffee remuda was 38 horses, a working string of experienced cow ponies, and a handful of young animals being introduced to the work for the first time. Frederick managed them with the competence he had always had around horses, a natural authority that animals responded to, a patience in the training that he had not always shown in other areas of his life. Coffee was a taciturn man who judged by results rather than by conversation, and his results with the remuda were excellent, which earned Frederick a kind of shorthand respect around the coffee outfit that he found unexpectedly satisfying. He rode out to the Aldridge farm on Sundays, which was the one day the livery work had never required him, and which became his in a new way now. He would arrive in the late morning and stay through the afternoon, and the Sundays became their own kind of territory, separate from the weekday efficiency of the morning work sessions, more personal, longer. They took to walking the property together after the midday work was done, following the fence lines or going down to the creek that ran below the east pasture, and they talked on these walks in a way that had a different quality than their working conversation, less practical, more exploratory. He told her about the drives he had been on as a boy, about his mother, who had died of pneumonia outside of Wichita when he was 21, and whom he had not been with when she went because he had been 3 counties away doing work he was not proud of. This was the thing that sat under everything else, this particular regret, that he had been the wrong kind of absent at the wrong time. He had never told anyone this before. He told Lenora walking along the creek in the August afternoon with the cottonwoods making their silver and green light above the water, and she listened to all of it, and then she put her hand through his arm, the way women walked with men in the manner of the time, and she said, "She raised you to survive." That means she succeeded. That is what she would have wanted to know. He did not know how to answer that. He walked beside her and was grateful in a way that had no good words for itself. She told him about the loneliness of the years after her mother died, about the specific kind of silence of a house with only a grieving father in it, the way he had channeled everything into the work, and she had done the same because it was the only way to be near him. She told him about the men in town who had made offers, 2 formal ones, properly brought through the appropriate social channels, both of which she had declined, because in neither case had the man in question been someone she felt she could truly be known by. She had a way of thinking about things that was unusual for anyone she had met, she said, and most people found it convenient rather than interesting, which was not the same as being truly seen. "Do you feel seen?" He asked because it was a direct question and he was asking it directly, which he had found was the only way to talk to Lenora. "I am beginning to," she said, and then after a pause, "Do you?" "Yes," he said without any delay. "It is uncomfortable." She laughed at that, a real laugh, not the polite kind, one that came up from somewhere genuine and surprised both of them a little. "I suppose it is," she said, "but I would not have it different," he added. "No," she agreed. Neither would I. The fall season arrived with the urgency that always accompanies the end of something and the beginning of something else. The drives were coming to their close. The land began to show its autumn face, the grass yellowing, the sky moving through its short, brilliant periods of clarity, the nights arriving earlier and cooler. Frederick drove Coffey's remuda through the final weeks of the cattle season with the contained efficiency of a man who has found a use for his energy that he is not ashamed of. And Calvin Prout, because circumstances are rarely uncomplicated, came back. He came back with a new approach and additional resources, which was something Frederick had been watching for since the summer. He arrived at the Aldridge farm on a Tuesday morning in September when Frederick happened to be there. He had taken a half-day from the Coffey outfit to help Lenora with the auction of 3 of the trained geldings, which was the major financial event of her year. Prout brought 2 men with him this time. Not overtly threatening, they were dressed for business, not trouble, but there was something in their positioning, the way they spread themselves slightly around the buggy, that told Frederick what they were for. He recognized the tactic because he had participated in versions of it himself, back in the years he was trying not to be ashamed of. Frederick was very still. He had a way of becoming still when things required it. Prout made his new offer to Lenora on the porch. It was higher than the previous one, and now came with a deadline. He framed it as a courtesy, a final opportunity before the railroad committed its survey and the nature of the land's value changed in ways that might not favor her. He was smooth and plausible, and the deadline was real enough pressure. Lenora looked at him. "I have told you twice, Mr. Prout. The answer is no." Prout's gaze moved to Frederick, who was standing by the corral gate, and then back to Lenora. "Miss Aldridge, I would encourage you to think very carefully. The coming months can be difficult for an operation of this scale without adequate resources. I would hate to see you placed in a position of Mr. Prout," Frederick said from the corral gate, in a voice that was absolutely even. "You have received your answer." Prout looked at him. Frederick looked back. This was the kind of moment that Frederick had a long history of, the moment where 2 men are deciding whether the situation is going to escalate or resolve, and he was experienced enough to know that what happened in it depended almost entirely on which man was more willing to hold his ground without moving. Frederick did not move. Prout was a businessman, not a fighter, and his men were hired for their presence rather than their use. After a moment, Prout inclined his head and went back to his buggy and drove away, and this time Frederick had the feeling it was not a temporary retreat. Lenora waited until the dust settled, then came down the porch steps and stood beside Frederick. "Thank you," she said. "He will not come back," Frederick said. "That kind of man does not continue pressing when the return is uncertain. He will find easier ground." "You are very certain of that?" "I know how that kind of man thinks," he said, with the particular honesty he had developed with her, the kind that acknowledged its own source without elaborate apology. "Because I have thought that way." She took that in. "And now," she said, "now I am thinking about what your stake in the railroad news means for this property," he said. "Because if the survey does come through east of town, you should have someone in that land office conversation. You should not let Prout be the only voice making claims about this property's position." She looked at him. "How do I do that?" "I know the surveying crew is headquartered in town this month," he said. "I have met the chief surveyor at the livery. His name is Ambrose, and he is a reasonable man. I can make an introduction. You would do that. I will do that." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with an expression he had learned to recognize, the expression of a woman who is calculating something, but not in a cold way, more in the way of a person trying to understand something they had not quite anticipated. "You are different than what I thought you were when you first came down my lane," she said. "What did you think I was?" "Someone who would take what was useful and move on," she said. "That is not an accusation. It is simply what you looked like." "It is what I was," he said. "What are you now?" He thought about it, genuinely, the way she always made him think, all the way to the real answer rather than stopping at the convenient one. "Trying to be someone worth what I want," he said. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. And then she reached up and put her hand against his face, her palm against his jaw with the scar along it. And the gesture was so deliberate and so completely Lenora purposeful and exact and full of things she did not need to say aloud, that Frederick felt the full weight of it move through him from the top of his head to the ground under his boots. "Frederick," she said, "I need to tell you something." "Yes," he said. "I have been thinking for some time about what I am going to do when the auction money runs out again," she said, "which will happen by spring if I do not find a way to expand the operation. And I have been thinking about it alone, which is something I have done with all my problems for the last 2 years, and I am—" She stopped, adjusted. "I'm very tired of thinking about things alone." He understood what she was saying. He understood all of it, the layers of it, the practical and the personal, the admission of need from a woman who almost never admitted it, the specific courage of saying you are tired of being alone when being alone has been your only reliable option. "You do not have to," he said, "think about things alone." "I know that now," she said. "I am telling you that I know it." He covered her hand with his where it rested against his jaw. "Lenora, yes, I want to ask you something." "Then ask it," she said with that directness, that absolute quality of meeting him where he was. "I want to ask you properly," he said, "not standing in the yard after a land agent has just driven away. Properly." The corner of her mouth moved in the way he loved. "All right," she said, "properly then." He took 3 days. He thought carefully about what properly meant for a man like him asking a woman like Lenora Aldridge, because he understood that the form of a thing matters, that it is not merely a formality but an expression of the value you place on what you are asking. He went to the Caldwell jeweler, a small operation run by a German immigrant named Maynard, and looked at what was available in the case. He had saved most of what Coffee had paid him over the summer, and he spent more of it than was practical on a ring with a small garnet stone set in silver, not grand, but considered, and the garnet was red as a Kansas sunset, and he thought she would know what he meant by it without him having to explain. He asked her on a Sunday evening in late September on the porch of her house, with the first cold in the air and the prairie stretching out behind her in the last of the light, golden and enormous and smelling of dry grass and distance. He said, "I know I am not what most men would call a safe choice. I know I do not come with a clean history or a large account or certainty about everything. But I know that I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you, and I think trying alongside you is different than trying alone. And I believe, that I can be a good man if I am building something with a person I am trying to deserve." She was looking at him with those gray eyes that held everything steady and honest, and they were bright with something in them that was not sadness. "Frederick Rhodes," she said. "Yes, I believe all of that," she said. "And I believe it because I have been watching you for 4 months, and I am an extremely accurate judge of horses, and I apply the same method to people." He laughed. It was an actual laugh, startled out of him, and he heard it with some surprise because he had not laughed freely at anything in longer than he could clearly recall. "Is that a yes?" he said. "Yes," she said. "That is a yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment, then looked at him, and he pulled her toward him and she came without any hesitation, and it was the first time he had held her fully, her arms around him and his around her. And she was solid and warm and real and here, and the whole enormous sky of Kansas was above them turning toward dark, and Frederick Rhodes thought, clearly and without any doubt, that this was the first thing in his life he had not wanted to take but to deserve. They were married in November. The ceremony was held in the Caldwell church, which had by that time acquired a more upright steeple, performed by the Reverend Cooper, who was a practical man who asked the relevant questions and moved through the proceedings with appropriate solemnity and occasional warmth. Lenora wore her mother's dress, which had been stored in a cedar chest in the upstairs room and still fit her as if it had been made with knowledge of the future. And Frederick wore his best coat and a new shirt purchased from the dry goods store, and his boots polished to a standard. he had never previously had occasion to meet. There were perhaps 30 people in the church. Durwood from the livery, who had become something like a friend in the way of men who work near each other and respect what they see. Elia's Coffee, who showed up in a clean coat and shook Frederick's hand with the particular warmth of a man who does not show warmth easily. Several neighboring ranchers and their wives who knew Lenora from the quarter horse trade. The Maynard family from the jewelry shop. Mr. Gibbs from the general store, who had the grace to appear genuinely pleased despite his former transactions with the bride. Frederick stood at the front of the church and watched Lenora walk down the aisle alone. She had no one left to walk with her, and she had told him quietly that she would do it herself, which was so precisely her that he had felt another one of those chest cavity shifts that she seemed to cause in him with regularity. And she was looking directly at him as she walked, not at the room, not at the people, at him, and the steadiness of it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He said his vows in a clear voice and meant every word, which was a new experience for him in the domain of promises, which he had not historically kept. But these were different. These were not promises of convenience or survival. These were promises he had chosen completely, with the full knowledge of what they cost. She said hers in the same clear, direct way she did everything, with her gray eyes holding his and her voice steady. And when the Reverend Cooper pronounced them married, and he kissed her in front of the assembled 30 people of Caldwell, Kansas in November of 1878, there was a sound of such genuine happiness from the room that even Frederick, who was not easily moved by collective sentiment, felt it go through him like a warm current. The winter settled down over the plains with its particular version of Kansas severity. Not the dramatic blizzards of the mountains, but a steady grinding cold and occasional ice storms that coated everything in glass and made the world look impossibly beautiful for a day before turning treacherous. Frederick and Lenora spent that first winter together in the farmhouse, and it became the period of time in which two people who have chosen each other discover what daily life together actually is: not the courtship, not the significant moments, but the ordinary dailiness of another person in your kitchen in the morning, sharing meals and decisions and firewood, and the particular negotiations of two different lives becoming one. They were good at it. Better than Frederick would have predicted for himself, which was saying something, because he had not expected to be good at any of this. But he and Lenora had a shared directness. They did not let things fester. They said what they meant. They argued occasionally with the particular intensity of people who care about getting things right, and then resolved it and moved forward without the toxic residue of unspoken resentment. He had not known that was how things could be. He had grown up around a kind of grievance that accumulated silently and came out sideways, and the contrast of this clean, forthright way of managing conflict was striking to him in a way he found himself grateful for. He took on the management of the horse operation fully. They worked out the arrangement together, sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp and a piece of paper. Lenora knew the horses and the breeding program in ways he was still learning, and he had capabilities in the business side that she acknowledged without false modesty were stronger than her own. They divided accordingly, which was how they made decisions about most things, by looking at what was actually true and working from there. In the spring of 1879, two things happened. The railroad survey confirmed what Prout had suspected: a new spur line was indeed coming through the eastern part of Caldwell County, and the Aldridge property was positioned well in relation to it. This did not mean the railroad would cross the land itself, but it meant the area's value was increasing, and the livestock trade would become easier in ways that had practical and meaningful implications for a quarter horse breeding operation. Lenora's decision not to sell, which had seemed simply determined through the previous year, now looked like the excellent judgment it had been. And Lenora told Frederick, on a morning in March when the first tentative green was showing in the pastures and the mares were restless with the change in the season, that she was pregnant. He was in the barn when she told him. He had been checking over Porter's hooves, which was a daily task with the older stallion. He straightened up and looked at her, and she looked at him with that expression she wore for significant things, very still, very direct. And he crossed the barn in 4 steps and put his arms around her and held her and said nothing for a long moment, because there was nothing he could have said that would have been adequate to what he was feeling. "Are you all right?" she asked, against his shoulder. "I am better than all right," he said. "I do not have a word for what I am." "I believe happy covers it," she said, with the dry precision he loved, and he held on tighter. The pregnancy was healthy, and Lenora managed it the way she managed everything, practically, without drama, though she allowed Frederick to take on more of the physical work around the property than she had previously permitted him to carry. This was itself a kind of progress, the allowing of help, which was not natural to her, and which she was learning with some effort. Their son was born in November of 1879, in the farmhouse, with the help of the town doctor and a neighboring woman named Mrs. Farquhar, who had assisted at many births, and who was calm and capable, and exactly the right person to have in the room. He came in the early morning with the darkness still on the plains, and his first statement to the world was loud and clear and thoroughly confident. Frederick was allowed in as soon as the doctor permitted it. He sat on the edge of the bed, and Lenora put the baby in his arms, and he looked down at this person, red-faced and enormous-eyed and wholly new. And something happened to him in that moment that he could not have described in any language he had access to, except that it felt like the final closing of a door that he had not known was still open. Not a bad closing, a completed one. The long room of who he had been sealed shut, and this was the other side of it. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly. The baby looked at him with the unfocused intensity of the newly born. "His name is Thomas," Lenora said from behind him, with a softness in her voice that she normally reserved for the hours between dark and first light, the private hours. "After my father." "Thomas," Frederick said. "Thomas Rhodes." "Thomas Rhodes," she agreed. He looked at her over the baby's head, and she looked back at him, and he thought, "This is what I was riding toward all those years." Through all of it, the camps and the bad work and the long, pointless road, I was going somewhere, and I did not know it, but this is where it was. Thomas Rhodes was, from the very beginning, a person of extraordinary opinions. By the time he was walking, he had firm views about the order of breakfast, the appropriate treatment of barn cats, and whether Trouble the filly should be allowed near the kitchen garden. He had Frederick's dark eyes and Lenora's strong jaw, and a combination of both their stubbornness that was, as Frederick observed to Lenora one evening with great admiration, entirely unprecedented in its intensity. The years moved the way years do on the plains in seasons and work, and the slow accumulation of what gets built when people stay somewhere and tend to it. The Aldridge quarter horse operation grew. Frederick managed the business negotiations with the ranchers and drive operators who came to buy horses, and his reputation, his legitimate reputation, built clean from the ground up in Caldwell County, became one of a man who was straight in his dealings and exceptionally knowledgeable about working horses. Elia's Coffee became a regular buyer. New ranchers coming into the area came to them on recommendation. By 1881, they had expanded the breeding program to 14 mares, and were considering a second stallion to complement Porter, who was aging with great dignity, and had produced more than 60 excellent foals in his time. They hired 2 hands, young brothers named Cal and Emmett Weiss, who came from a farm family north of town, and who were good workers and good-natured, and who became fixtures of the property in the way that people do when a place becomes home to them by accumulation rather than decision. Frederick and Lenora had a second child in 1882, a girl they named Clara, who arrived with the same confident volume as her brother, and who, from her first days, had an absolute certainty about what she wanted that made both her parents look at each other across whatever room they were in with an expression that was partly amusement and partly awe. One evening in the fall of that year, When Thomas was nearly 3 and Clara was new enough that she still slept much of the day, Frederick sat on the porch in the last of the October light, and Lenora came out and sat beside him with her coffee cup warm in her hands. And the quiet was the kind of quiet that only happens between people who have been together long enough that silence is not empty but full. "I want to tell you something," Frederick said. "Then tell me," she said. "I rode into Caldwell in July of 1878 intending to take something," he said. "That was the plain truth of it. I had been doing what I had always done, taking what was available, not asking much more of myself than that." She was quiet, listening. "And then I saw you arguing with Gibbs over a contract," he said, "and something happened that I could not explain then and cannot fully explain now. Something in me recognized that I did not want to take anything from you. I wanted to be the kind of man who had something to offer." The light on the plains was doing its late autumn thing, golden and long and thick as honey, stretched across the grass in a way that made the whole world look like something worth painting. "You were not that man yet," she said, without any judgment in it. "No," he said, "I was not, but you let me try to become him." "I watched you try," she corrected. "There is a difference. I did not give you the trying. You did that yourself." He looked at her. She was watching the light, her profile quiet and strong and entirely familiar to him now in the way that only comes from years of watching someone in every kind of light and every kind of weather. "Are you happy?" he asked. She turned and looked at him, and the thing in her face was the same thing that had been there the evening he kissed her in the stable doorway with the rain around them, the thing he had spent the first months after seeing it trying to trust. It was simply and entirely real. No performance, no management, no careful presentation. Just true. "I am happy," she said. "Are you?" "More than I knew was available to me," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was the closest she came to a demonstrative gesture in the public parts of the day, and the cotton of her dress was warm from the afternoon sun. And behind them in the house, Thomas was making the particular noise he made when he had decided it was time for someone to pay attention to him. And Clara would wake up soon for her evening feeding. And the horses were moving in the north pasture with the particular late-day energy that always preceded sunset. And the scar along Frederick's jaw caught the October light. He had been raised to take what he could get. He had learned what that cost, not in any dramatic accounting, but in the slow erosion of a self that has no anchor, no real root, nothing to build toward. He had spent years not knowing that he was missing anything. Lenora Aldridge, Lenora Rhodes now, though she kept both names in the business dealings because the Aldridge name meant something in the horse trade, and she was nothing if not practical, had been the first thing he had wanted to deserve rather than take. And the wanting of it, the work of it, the day-after-day effort of becoming the man that wanting required, this had turned out to be not a constraint but a liberation, the most fundamental one he had ever known. She had not saved him. He was careful about that distinction in his own mind because it was important, and because she would have been the first to correct it. She had not rescued him from himself. She had seen someone in him that was already there, buried under years of poor schooling in what mattered, and she had been willing to wait with clear eyes while he found it. That was its own thing, more generous than rescue, in some ways, because it required the belief that the person was capable of finding their own way, and the patience to let them. Thomas came to the door and pressed his face against the screen with the confident authority of a child who has never been unwelcome anywhere in his life, and said, in his best imitation of a serious voice, "Papa, come see what I found." "What did you find?" Frederick said. "Something very important," Thomas said. "More important than the sunset." Thomas considered this with great seriousness. "Almost," he decided. Frederick looked at Lenora. She was already smiling, the real smile, the one that came up without warning and changed everything about her face. He stood and offered her his hand, and she took it, and they went inside together, to see what was very important, to manage the evening hours, to put the children to bed and sit together by the fire in the cool October night, and talk about the spring foal season and the new stallion they were considering, and whether Cal Weiss was ready for more responsibility in the training program. The ordinary, magnificent substance of a life being lived by two people who had found each other on a Kansas road in the summer of 1878, one of them with a broken gate post and a horse that would not load into the wind, one of them riding past with no intention of stopping, both of them entirely unprepared for what the stopping would cost and give. The trouble filly had grown into a beautiful mare. She was 11 years old now, and she was exactly as Frederick had predicted when he gave her her unofficial name: intelligent, highly opinionated, and into everything she could reach. She had produced 3 foals of her own, all of them excellent, all of them with something of her sideways boldness in the way they moved. Lenora had refused every offer on her, which was not strictly the best business decision, and which Frederick had never once suggested she reconsider. Some things were not for sale. Lenora had known that long before he had. He had learned it from watching her. The winter of 1882 brought a cold that settled deep into the bones of the plains, the kind that arrived in November and did not intend to leave until March or later, that turned the water troughs to ice each morning, and made the horses grow coats so thick they looked like entirely different animals than their summer selves. Frederick and Cal and Emmett added a second layer of boards to the vulnerable north side of the stable, and they kept fires going in the small stove at the barn's end, and Lenora moved through the shortened days with her usual purposeful efficiency, keeping the books and managing the foal watch schedule for the 2 mares due in early spring and cooking meals that were substantial enough for men working in genuine cold. On the coldest evening of that winter, a night in January when the temperature fell to something that made the very air seem fragile, Frederick sat up with the older of the 2 pregnant mares while the rest of the house slept. He had a lamp and a blanket and the warm animal company of the stable. Porter breathed steadily in his stall. Trouble moved once and then resettled. He thought about his father, which he did sometimes and which was no longer as purely bitter as it had once been. He thought about the camps and the drives, about his mother's hands that were always chapped from the washing, about the particular face a man makes when he has decided the world is against him and has stopped examining whether that is true. He thought about the boy he had been, learning that lesson that you take, because taking is what there is, and he thought about the distance between that and here, this stable in Kansas with the cold pressing against the boards outside and the lamp throwing warm light in a circle, and inside that circle a life he had built with someone who had required him to be better than what he came from. Not required it cruelly. Required it by being herself, by being the kind of person whose company demanded that you bring the best of what you were, not because she insisted on it, but because anything less felt like a waste of something valuable. In the morning, before the rest of the household was up, Lenora came to the stable in her heavy coat with 2 cups of coffee, which was something she did when she knew he had spent the night with the animals. She handed him one and looked at the mare and then at him. "Everything all right," she said. "Everything is good," he said. She sat down on the stool across from him and held her coffee cup with both hands, watching the mare. In the lamplight and the first gray at the gaps in the stable boards that meant morning was coming, she looked exactly like herself, no different from the woman who had argued over a contract with Gibbs 6 years ago, and entirely different, and Frederick found that he still had not stopped paying attention to her, that she still caught him, that the noticing had not become habitual in the way of things that have been possessed too long. She caught him looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You." She looked at him with mild exasperation and great warmth, which was an expression he could have described exactly and which was specifically for him. He had learned over time, in the way that certain things between 2 people are only theirs. "Drink your coffee," she said. He drank his coffee. Outside the cold pressed down on the Kansas plains, and the sun was beginning its slow January arrival at the edge of the world, And in the stable, a man who had been raised to take what he could get sat across from the woman who had been the first thing he had ever wanted to deserve. And they drank their coffee in the lamplight and waited for morning together. And everything was exactly as it should be. The spring came the way it always does on the plains, slowly at first and then with a sudden extravagant rush. The ground softening, the creek running high with snowmelt, the returning sound of birds that had been absent since October. Both mares foaled safely in March. A bay colt from the trouble line that showed every sign of having his grandmother's opinions, and a gray filly who arrived in the early morning quiet with a kind of serene self-possession that Lenora said was, in her professional judgment, an excellent omen. Thomas named the gray filly Missouri, for reasons he explained at considerable length to anyone who would listen. And the name, unlike most things Thomas offered at age 3, had the ring of something that would stick. Frederick stood at the corral fence in the March morning watching Missouri find her legs in the tentative, uncertain way of newborn horses, all angles and determination, and he felt the season turning under him the way seasons do on the plains, not metaphorically but literally, the earth warming underfoot, the air moving differently, the whole enormous world reorganizing itself toward another year. He was 29 years old. He had a wife who was the clearest-eyed and most genuinely admirable person he had ever known, a son who was already more opinionated than both his parents combined, a daughter who had decided from her first weeks that the world was hers to examine, and a property that was growing year by year into something solid and real. He had built it by working, and by choosing, and by the slow, persistent, daily effort of being the man Lenora had believed he could be before he had believed it himself. He had not taken it. That was the thing he returned to, that simple and fundamental truth. He had not taken it. He had earned it, every morning of it, every hour. The fence posts and the gate and the book with the garnet ring and the Sunday walks and the vows and the children and the coffee and the lamplight and the new foals in the spring corral. He heard the kitchen door open and Lenora came out across the yard with her coat on and Thomas attached to her hand. And when Thomas saw the new foal in the corral, he made the specific sound that small children make when they see something wonderful, and pulled free of his mother's hand and ran to the fence. And Lenora came and stood beside Frederick, and he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him. "Missouri is doing well," he said. "She is going to be extraordinary," Lenora said. "Look at the way she's already working out her balance. She's going to figure it out." "She has her grandmother's confidence," Frederick said. "She has good stock," Lenora said. "On both sides." He looked at her. She was watching Thomas at the fence, her profile in the March morning, the first real warmth of the year coming in sideways across the flats and lighting up the gray in her eyes. And Frederick Rhodes thought the same thing he had been thinking in various forms since a morning in July 6 years ago when he had helped a woman load a horse into the wind. That this was worth becoming, that she had been worth the becoming, that he would spend the rest of his life being grateful not just for what he had, but for who he had been asked to be in order to have it. "What are you thinking?" she said, feeling his eyes on her the way she always did. "That you are the best thing that ever found me," he said. She turned and looked at him with that expression, the real one, the unguarded one, and she said, "You were not found. You came down my lane and fixed my gate post." "You let me," he said. "I did," she said. She reached up and touched the scar along his jaw, the old one from Abilene, with the particular tenderness that still caught him every time. "I am glad I did." "So am I," he said, "more than I can tell you." "You tell me adequately," she said. He laughed, and she smiled, and Thomas shouted something from the fence about Missouri trying to run, and Clara, inside the house, made herself known in the way of a person who has decided sleeping is over, and the spring moved across the Kansas plains in its golden and ordinary and wholly extraordinary way, and everything was complete.